From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kohatkar. It's Tuesday, August 25th, 2015. As the US-Iran deal faces opposition in Congress, we'll examine what the Iranian Jewish community thinks of it with my guest Reese Ehrlich. And President Obama's immigrant family detention policy faces a hurdle as a federal judge declares it unlawful. Plus, Amazon.com's brutal workplace and what it means for work, society, and family. That's coming up after the news. Joining us to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hello, Sonali.
Republican presidential candidate Jeb Bush has put his foot in his mouth, adding the ire of another minority community. In an event in McAllen, Texas yesterday, he was confronted about his use of the racist term anchor babies. He stumbled and then blurted, "What I was talking about was the specific case of fraud being committed where there's organized efforts. Frankly, it's more related to Asian people coming into our country, having children in that organized effort, taking advantage of a noble concept which is birthright citizenship," end of quote. His rival Donald Trump, who spearheaded the use of the term in this campaign, gleefully blasted him on Twitter, saying, quote, "In a clumsy move to get out of his anchor babies dilemma, where he signed that he would not use the term and now uses it, he blamed Asians." Democratic congressional representative Linda Sanchez from California wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post headlined, "When it comes to the politics of immigration, the GOP's candidates are sinvergüenzas, shameless." Well, Bob, do you agree with Sanchez's characterization?
Well, I think these folks are going to have to work to get up to the level of shameless. I don't think they're there yet. There's something bizarre when Donald Trump tells you you're not racist in the right way, I guess, is what this reduces to. I mean, what we should remember is immigration politics is always about race politics. And to some degree, it's also about wealth politics. You know, why might people want to have children in the U.S.? Because apparently every now and then someone does travel to the U.S. hoping their child will be born here. It's about the disproportionate share of wealth we have in the United States. You know, this is always and always will be a stand-in politics, not about real issues, but about what people are afraid of.
A black women's book club is claiming that they were unfairly removed from a wine train in Napa, California over the weekend. The 11 women were apparently enjoying themselves on the train when train authorities escorted them off, saying that they were laughing and talking too loudly. The women were refunded for their tickets. One of the group's members, Lisa Johnson, who posted about the incident on her Facebook, said, quote, "All we were guilty of is #LaughingWhileBlack." Johnson said, quote, "That was the most humiliating and embarrassing thing I've ever experienced in my life, to be paraded through all those cars, all those passengers looking at us, wondering what we do that was so bad that we were being escorted off that train." End of quote. The group, calling itself Sisters on the Reading Edge Book Club, were met by police officers at the St. Helena station where they were dumped. Napa Valley wine train spokesperson disagreed that the women were kicked off because of their race. He told press, "No, it's not racism, it's acute insensitivity." Bob, what do you make of this story? I wonder if a group of 11 white women might have been treated in this manner.
Well, excuse me, when I first thought about this story, I thought about Richard Pryor. So if I break into my imitation of Richard Pryor imitating uptight white people, bear with me here, because I think Pryor did really nail this. This is a question, I think, not only of race, but of class and who gets to define public space. White people, especially white people with money, have always assumed that we get to define the nature of public space. And when other people, quote unquote, other people come in and say, listen, this is public space and we are going to enjoy that space, there's a pushback. So this is about race. Of course, it's about race. It's also about class. It's about the way that people who have long felt entitled to define public space, that is people who look like me, get really, really nervous when others claim that right as well.
And finally, economists are still anxious about the stock market after Chinese stocks dramatically plunged yesterday on what was dubbed Black Monday. The U.S. stock market did recover this morning, and the Washington Post described the rebound saying, quote, "The sharp start marked the first encouraging news after several days of chaotic trades in which many large U.S. companies lost billions of dollars in market value amid a global sell-off." But the news in China has remained dire. One Chinese analyst based in Shanghai told the press, "At the moment there's panic in the market because we have lots of retail investors. We've never experienced anything like this in China's stock market, the speed of the decline and the scale of it." Well, Bob, for the rest of us who never made billions or trillions on China's manufacturing boom, this all seems very abstract. How can we lose something we never had to begin with? But we will all be affected nonetheless if this keeps up, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're all in the stock market in some sense if we have any kind of savings or pension. Everyone understands that our own futures are sort of tied into this. But I think going back to your fundamental point is important. What is value? I mean, they say that billions of dollars of market value were lost overnight, but what do we mean by value? An economy, remember, is supposed to care for people. It's supposed to be the way we produce and distribute and consume goods and services. But so much of our economy has nothing to do with what people need. This is a reminder that we're all in this globalized world exposed, even if we don't endorse the values underlying it. So yes, it's a problem, but it's a problem in a bigger sense that the whole economy is this house of cards waiting to topple.
Bob, thanks as always for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks, Sonali.
Robert Jensen is an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. He's our daily newsflash guest expert. And by the way, if you miss any of our interviews, you can catch them at our website, uprisingwithsonali.com. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. The U.S. Congress has until September 17th to ratify President Obama's signature foreign policy achievement, the Iran nuclear deal. But much uncertainty remains, mostly due to Republican intransigence over any cooperation with Iran. But both Democratic and Republican members recently returned from a summer trip to Israel funded by the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, which is the main lobby group for the Israeli government. AIPAC and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have made it their mission to convince Congress to vote down the Iran nuclear deal. But what do Jewish Iranians think about the deal? Iran is home to one of the largest Jewish populations in the Middle East after Israel. Persian Jews have called Iran their home for many generations, and my guest, Reese Erlich, just returned from a trip to Iran where he reported on Jewish Iranian views on the nuclear deal for the Global Post. Reese Erlich is a veteran freelance foreign correspondent. He's traveled widely across the Middle East. He just returned from reporting from Iran, and he's written a number of books, including Conversations with Terrorist Middle East Leaders on Politics, Violence, and Empire. Welcome to Uprising, Reese.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, in your writings for the Global Post, you said most Iranian Jews strongly disagree with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's denunciations of the nuclear accord. How did you arrive at that conclusion?
Well, I had an opportunity to interview over 24 people, both Jews and Muslims. I met with leaders of the of the Jewish community, and I visited a kosher restaurant and interviewed people at random. And Iranian Jews, like Iranians in general, support the accord because they see it as a way to lift the horrific sanctions that have been imposed on Iran and also lessen tensions and lessen the possibility of war.
Now, right-wing websites like Breitbart have called your claim that most Iranian Jews support the deal as, quote, dubious. They pointed out that you only spoke with 3 people to arrive at your conclusion. How do you respond?
Well, there were 3 people cited in the story, but as I mentioned, I spoke with many, many more than that. As in any journalistic article, you select the best and most interesting quotes. It was a relatively short article. I think what's really bothering Breitbart and some of these other right-wing websites that have attacked me is that, first of all, there are Jews in the world and indeed in the United States who disagree strongly with Netanyahu and who support the accord. They can't get their minds wrapped around that. And secondly, that the people of Iran are supportive of the agreement, that it makes sense from their standpoint. And frankly, if the Israeli position prevails, it's likely to lead to certainly to more tensions and possibly war.
Breitbart also labeled you, quote, an apologist for the Iranian regime who has shown anti-Israel bias. Any response to that?
Well, how interesting that they didn't bother to do their research. I've been covering Iran since 2001. I've written many criticisms of Iran, including when I was there in 2009 during the elections. The uprising took place, which I'm sure many of your viewers are familiar with. After the fraudulent elections, I wrote extensively and spoke on this program and elsewhere criticizing the Iranian government. So what bothers these guys is that I'm not an apologist for the U.S. government either. So as far as I'm concerned, I apologize neither for the U.S., for Israel, nor for Iran.
So let's talk about why the opinions of the Iranian Jewish community is significant. How big is this population? It is significant inside Iran, but still a tiny number. NPR reported there are 9,000 Jews in Iran, making Iran the 3rd largest home in the Middle East for the Jewish community after Israel and then Turkey. You report it's actually the 2nd largest, numbering at 12 to 30,000 people.
Well, part of the problem is there's a lot of conflict about what the numbers are. The Jewish member of parliament in Tehran said there were as many as 30,000. A census showed there were 8,000, but there's some question about that. Another Jewish leader said 9 to 12,000. So I simply reported the figures that were given to me, and I think it's a little difficult to assess the exact number. It is way smaller than the numbers that lived there before 1979. It was somewhere around 100,000 Jews. Many of them left. Many of them now live in Los Angeles and other parts of the United States. They left because of, partially because many were economically better off, and they saw that their lives were going to be better. They didn't want to live under a repressive theocratic regime in Iran, and others feared anti-Semitism, and so most of the Jews who had lived in Iran have left.
What about those who do remain within Iran? How does the Jewish community fit within Iran? And I mean, of course, they've been a persecuted minority, but is it true that under the new leadership of Hassan Rouhani, the condition of Jews in Iran has slightly or somewhat improved?
Yes, I think the key thing is that Jews are allowed to practice their religion. You can see people on the streets with wearing yarmulkes or kippahs, if you use the Hebrew word. You can go, there's 6 kosher restaurants, there's at least half a dozen functioning synagogues and cheters or Hebrew schools. So they are allowed, as are Christians, by the way. And there's there was a fatwa by Ayatollah Khamenei back in the late 70s, early 80s, saying the Jews have to be protected, they can't be persecuted. But keep in mind, it's a theocratic state. So by law and by custom, for example, there are no non-Muslim ministers in the government. To be a professional army officer, you have to be a Muslim, which means if you're a Christian or a Jew, you're out of luck. There are many Jews who are professionals as work as professors or as doctors. There is a Jewish hospital that I visited and wrote about in my stories. But it's not, because it is a theocratic state, it is certainly not free or adhering to the kind of secular values that most Americans would want to see.
Do the political views of the Iranian Jewish community, where do they sort of lie? Is there a way to pinpoint them? Do they often fit with the rest of non-Jewish Iranians? Do they align with the Israeli government, or are they fairly independent?
Well, for sure, they do not ally with the Israeli government, certainly under Netanyahu. He's considered an extremist, as, by the way, he is by Jews around the world. He is particularly on this issue of the nuclear accord. Israel has numerous times threatened to bomb Iran. We now know from the biography of Barak, the former prime minister, that in 2010, 11, and 12, Israel was seriously planning to bomb Iran. This is quite understandable. If you're an Iranian Jew living in Tehran, you're not anxious to get bombed by anybody, let alone by Israel. So there's very strong disagreement with Netanyahu's policies on that. There have been numerous incidents of anti-Semitic, not just anti-Zionist activity, particularly under Ahmadinejad. There were the airing of a couple of anti-Semitic documentaries and feature programs that were imported from other countries. The Jewish community protested, and that seems to have died down. And of course, Ahmadinejad's infamous comments doubting the existence of the Holocaust, all of that was protested by the Jewish community there. Under Rouhani, there have been some positive changes affecting the Hebrew schools and others. And again, the Jewish leaders there feel that he's providing a much better situation for Jews in Iran.
How significant is it that Iranian Jews back the U.S.-Iran nuclear accord?
Well, in terms, it's more a kind of interest. There are such small numbers in Iran. Remember, Iran is about 80 million people, so obviously it's a small minority. But I think the reason the right wing here got so upset about it is because they want to pretend that Jews all over the world, in the United States and Europe, and as well as Iran, support Israeli policies, and that's simply not true.
And let's talk briefly also about the situation here in the United States. I mentioned that the AIPAC funded trip for members of Congress to Israel during the summer recess. I mean, how many political and ethical lines does that cross?
Well, let's just put the shoe on the other foot. What if the Iranian government had sponsored a trip all over Iran to learn their position on the accords, and a bunch of U.S. congressmen had gone on that? My God, Can you imagine the uproar, the hubbub about that? Oh my God, how can you believe what they're telling you? They're paid for the trip, blah, blah, blah. Well, AIPAC has been doing this for years. This goes back. They've cultivated Republican and Democratic congresspeople, senators, and other politicians for decades. But somehow that's okay because they're an ally and they have a lot of money to throw around. But I think it's total hypocrisy.
And the September 17th deadline for Congress to approve this deal is approaching fast. How likely, finally, do you think it is that this may pass? Most of the news reports that I've seen don't really know how to predict the vote in Congress around this deal.
Yeah, I'm not sure anybody knows exactly what the vote's going to be, but it's a high hurdle for them to sink the Vienna Accords. In order to pass the Senate, in order to defeat the resolution in the Senate, they need 60 votes because of a threatened filibuster. And then if the president vetoes it, they need 67 votes. And that the right wing does not seem to have. As far as I can tell, everything that I've read, the veto will be upheld, and that means the accord will go into effect.
Well, Reese, I want to thank you, as always, for joining us today. And we'll post links to your articles in the Global Post around the trip you just took from our website later today. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
Reese Erlich is a veteran foreign correspondent, just returned from Iran. He's visited there many times, and his articles about the Iranian Jewish community can be found at the Global Post, or you can check uprisingwithsonali.com later today. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. A federal judge in California late last week ordered the immediate end to the detention of undocumented minors in the United States. Under President Obama, an abandoned practice of imprisoning whole families in detention centers was revived. The mostly privately run facilities have struggled to maintain a reputation for being safe spaces for mothers and children. U.S. District Judge Dolly G. on Friday issued her ruling to release children, quote, without unnecessary delay. She had already ruled against the practice earlier this year based on a violation of a 1997 court settlement on migrant children, but was asked by the government to reconsider. She dismissed the government's arguments, calling them, quote, repackaged and reheated. Meanwhile, two immigration attorneys working with detainees found out recently that they were barred from a family detention center in Dilley, Texas, for alleged violations of visitation rights. Immigrant rights advocates have denounced the move, saying it is unprecedented to bar lawyers. My guest is Jonathan Ryan. He is the executive director of RAICES, which stands for the Refugee and Immigrant Center for Education and Legal Services, based in Texas. Welcome to Uprising, Jonathan.
Thank you for having me.
Well, first, let's talk about the district judge's ruling. How important is Judge Dolly G's ruling to order children be immediately released?
This is a landmark decision. It is truly an important order. In this order, Judge G found what she had been telling us all along, that these detention centers are deplorable, to use her words. She outright criticized even the manner in which the government prepared its filings before her, slamming the government for attempting to file this motion to reconsider her order without even styling it as such. She had to literally interpret what the government was attempting to do, much like a law professor had to interpret what a first-year law student was writing in her paper. The decision found that it is against the law that has been standing since 1998 to house children in these prison-like settings. And the judge found that anything over 3 days is outside of the law, except for under some emergency situations. So we anticipate that although the government may appeal, and probably will appeal this decision, that they, if they wish to follow this law, would need to release what we think would be almost 80% of the women and children who are currently detained.
Now, she cited a 1997 settlement that should have, right from the outset, barred this practice. But not only have families been detained under President Bush, but under President Obama. Under Obama, the practice briefly stopped for a few years and then was restarted again. What was that original settlement, and why has that not been adhered to?
That's right. So a case was brought in 1985, in fact, on behalf of children who were being kept in immigrant detention centers, which at the time were really just county lockups, where they were putting children together with adults who were in immigration custody and adults who were in criminal detention. And as a result of that lawsuit in 1997 and then finalized in 1998, a settlement that's come to be known as the Flores Settlement laid out how the government must treat children who are in its custody. Now, for the last year, the federal government, the Obama administration, has attempted to argue that the presence of the mother along with the child exempts the government from having to house children in licensed facilities. And so therefore they have been imprisoning these children in for-profit detention centers. Well, last Friday, Judge G reminded the government that the Flores settlement covers all children in government custody, and therefore they cannot hold them any longer in these for-profit prisons.
So if the government were to comply, would it simply order the children released and keep the mothers imprisoned, or is that just unknown at this point?
Well, in fact, in an August 6th filing, the government said just that. They warned Judge G that if she were to sign this order, that they could begin a process of separating the mothers from the children. And in fact, in some isolated circumstances, we have seen that. But to truly follow the judge's order, what the government must do is initiate a process by which they release all of the women and children who have been in these facilities for longer than the Flores settlement allows. They will do that in an orderly way. All of these families have family members here in the United States who have been willing all along to pay for their housing, for their food, for all of their expenses. So this is not a case of women and children who will be simply released out into the streets. These are all people who have somewhere to go. They're being held up in that process of reuniting with their families by the federal government detention policy.
And during the time when the Obama administration took a break from family detention, that's what happened, right? Families who were found to be undocumented were released into the custody of other relatives while they waited for their cases to be processed. And for some reason, which I'm sure there are plenty, perhaps to appear tough on immigration, the Obama administration started to imprison families again. What do you think the government's going to do? Could it appeal Judge Dolly G's decision?
Yes, the government is expected to appeal this judge's decision. And it's a minor point, but an important one, that although the Obama administration did stop the detention of families at the Teton Hutto facility in Texas, there has been a family detention facility in Pennsylvania that has remained online even after the Obama administration closed Teton Hutto. And in many respects, it was this fact that it remained in even a small number that allowed this current expansion rather than an actual true initiation of family detention, which is really further proof why we must end this policy forever if we truly want to see it put to bed. Now,
so you're saying that it was never actually put to bed, even briefly. It did continue at a very small level.
Unfortunately, the case, it did remain even at a small level, which in a sense allowed the government to, without changing the law or major policies, to in fact bring it back on large scale. But what you say is absolutely true, that generally the policy, and this has been stated in memorandum, in public statements in the past, that asylum seekers, refugees, who have been found by the federal government, by the asylum office, to have a credible fear of returning to their countries and who have presented a letter of support from a family member should, in most cases, in fact, in everything but the most extreme cases, be released to their family members to follow their proceedings from outside of detention. And all of the studies and statistics show that when you simply provide access to pro bono attorneys, such as those who work at RAICES and our other partner agencies, that women and children have a much higher chance of appearing at court and eventually prevailing in their asylum cases. It's more inexpensive to the taxpayer to provide services over detention, which is extremely costly. And it is also just happens to be the right thing to do.
And Jonathan, speaking of attorneys who have done pro bono work, what do you make of the news that these two attorneys that I'd mentioned earlier, who were working with immigrants being held in Dilley, Texas, were sent letters barring them over violations of visitation rights? Groups are saying that this sort of move is unprecedented.
It really is. It shocks the conscience to think that the government can pick and choose which advocates are allowed to meet with their clients. We have experienced this in my agency. Numerous legal assistants have been banned from visiting these detention centers. I've had my own attorneys grilled while attempting to enter these facilities as to why they are meeting with their clients. It is a real height of irony that the government said in its filing that it in fact needed to preserve the detention centers exactly to provide a location for attorneys to meet with clients, when in fact what we see on the ground is that they make every attempt to thwart our access, to block our access, and here in this case, the unprecedented move to in fact bar attorneys from visiting their clients in detention.
What was the reason given? I mean, I mentioned violations of visitation rights, but when reading the details, it appears that all the attorneys were guilty of was advocating pretty strongly for their clients.
Yeah, we are, I think we must remember, in a civil context. Although the government is putting people in jails, although they're putting ankle monitors, shackles really, on these women, stigmatizing them as criminals, this is a civil litigation context. The attorneys and the government, through ICE, are engaged in civil litigation. There are two parties to a suit. And what we are seeing really right now is one party to that suit using every bit of advantage it can in the fact that it controls access to our clients to push and to throw its weight around against these pro bono attorneys, who I remind you are private attorneys who took time from their practices, closed down their offices in other cities, took that loss, spent money to fly here, to stay in a hotel, just to defend the rights of poor, vulnerable people who are never going to pay them one red cent. It really is, I think, an affront to not just our system of justice, but really our principles as Americans. Just after having celebrated the end of World War II, that we are currently engaging in really trying to upend and thwart the very asylum and refugee laws that were written by that greatest generation after World War II. It really is, it just shows, I think, unfortunately, how far we've come and potentially how much we've forgotten about the history of our country.
Jonathan, there are several family detention centers around the country, several in Texas. I mentioned Dilley. There's one in Texas called Carnes that has been implicated in sexual abuse of undocumented female detainees, which was investigated by the federal government but dismissed. And recently, I understand your organization, Rice, has found some evidence suggesting that, in fact, women were sexually taken advantage of in the detention center by guards. Can you tell us a little bit about what you found?
We are currently waiting on answers from the federal government. We submitted a FOIA request based on the Freedom of Information Act for information about the locations inside the detention center that appear by reports to not be visible by the security cameras that are placed there in order to protect the women from any potential abuse against other residents or indeed against by the staff. What we found is that the response to our request omitted large sections of information. And so we are pursuing our request and asking that the federal government release all of the information about the blind spots that exist in these detention centers where no camera can see.
So let's finally talk about the fact that the issue of immigration is rearing its head in the news quite a bit, but generally it's the Republicans that are getting in trouble for their anti-immigrant and racist rhetoric. We discussed on our program earlier Jeb Bush's comments on anchor babies, so-called anchor babies, a very racist term that he had to backtrack when confronted by Latinos in an audience. He said, well, actually, I was really talking about Asians. Donald Trump, of course, who was the one who started using that term during this latest campaign. But here we are, you and I, talking about something that the Obama administration has been doing with not as much media coverage. Where's the outrage from progressives who claim they're pro-immigrant, who denounce Republican anti-immigrant stances, but haven't spoken out about the Obama administration's practice of imprisoning children and mothers?
I can only but agree on the case of this horrific term that's being employed to describe. I heard one presidential candidate say, "Well, give me another term. What else would you call them? How about
People?
U.S. citizens?
Yeah.
How about future voters? How about future candidates for president of the United States?" I think that as people climb the ladder of success on the faces of the future of our country, they really need to stop and think, what future are they leading us towards? But in terms of your other point, that it's true, this is an Obama administration policy decision. Many people might think, well, this is a story of cowboy border patrol in Texas, renegade officers. But no, this is a White House policy. This is a policy that started in the White House and has not budged. We've seen many ICE officers, quite frankly, in the rank and file, who themselves, I think, are tired, fed up enforcing this policy of family detention. But for some reason, the senior leadership in ICE and the Obama administration have done nothing but double down at every opportunity to take an off-ramp from this misguided, dangerous experiment in family detention. Instead, we have seen the Obama administration continue. And I think it speaks to a fundamental point about this conversation, something that is being completely missed. As we talk about the immigration issue in the United States, we must remember that these are refugees. And the issue of refugees is one completely independent, really, from that of our national debate on immigration. The discussion of refugees is not truly about who, but about whom. To whom do we as a government, as the strongest country on earth, as the leader of nations, what responsibility do we owe to vulnerable populations of refugees who seek protection in our country? And the reality is, it's the same responsibility that we demand from every other country on earth. Let us remember that Lebanon currently is 20% refugee, mainly Syrians fleeing the conflict in that country. We as a nation have accepted merely a few hundred Syrian refugees. This is an issue about where does the United States stand in history, and where do we stand among other nations that we consider members of the nation, the community of nations, who together hold a high responsibility to protect refugees. That is what it's about, recognizing and identifying these people as refugees fleeing violence. They're not here on vacation. They're not here to steal our jobs. They're here to save their own lives.
Jonathan, give out a website for your organization.
You can find us if you Google RAICES, that's RAICES. Our website is raicestexas.org. That's all one word, raicestexas.org. Right now, we are trying to raise money for backpacks for the women and children who, after they are released from detention, are merely dumped off at the local Greyhound bus station. Our organization is going to the bus station and providing backpacks to the women and children who must take 3 to 4 day bus rides to meet their families. We're also providing overnight hospitality to women who miss their buses or who don't have a bus to take. And so we are trying to gather as much support for that effort to support these women instead of trying to prosecute them.
And we'll post a link to that page on uprisingwithsonali.com later today. Thanks so much, Jonathan.
Thank you for your time.
Jonathan Ryan is the executive director of RAICES, which stands for the Refugee and Immigrant Center for Education and Legal Services, based in Texas. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. A lengthy expose by the New York Times last week about Amazon.com's work environment has made serious waves. Journalists Jody Cantor and David Stretfield wrote the piece entitled Inside Amazon, Wrestling Big Ideas in a Bruising Workplace. After interviewing more than 100 current and former employees working for the online retail giant, the Times concluded that, quote, the company is conducting an experiment in how far it can push white-collar workers to get them to achieve its ever-expanding ambitions. Amazonians, as employees are referred to, have a brutal culture of snitching on one another to management, a practice they are formally encouraged to engage in. And those struggling with unexpected illnesses or caregiving needs or even pregnancy are often pushed out for not being committed enough. Regular performance evaluations are designed to weed out weaker employees, and work-life balance is frowned upon. One former worker said, Amazon is where overachievers go to feel bad about themselves. Amazon founder Jeff Bezos, whose culture of work ethics apparently drives how the company treats its workers, responded to the article saying it read like a description of, quote, a soulless dystopian workplace where no fun is had and no laughter is heard. He added, I don't recognize this Amazon, and I very much hope you don't either. Anyone working in a company that really is like the one described in the New York Times would be crazy to stay. I know I would leave such a company, Mr. Bezos said, who is one of the richest people in the world. His company is the nation's largest online retailer. Joining me now from Oxford, England, is Simon Head. He is the Senior and Associate Fellow of the Rothermere American Institute at Oxford. He is also the author of The New Ruthless Economy, Work and Power in the Digital Age. And his latest book is called Mindless, Smarter Machines Are Making Dumber Humans. Welcome to Uprising, Simon.
Good to be with you.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, the writers of the Times piece seem to have done their homework by interviewing a large number of former employees, having very few unnamed sources. And before we get into the nitty-gritty, how do you assess the veracity of this article?
I think the veracity is high. My own research on this subject has been focused on the working conditions of employees working on the shop floor at Amazon's so-called fulfillment centers. And the spirit of the work regime there is very similar to what the Times reporters tell us about the management level. So for me, the Times piece is very interesting because it extends the description of the Amazon work regime rather higher up the hierarchy. And we can see that these draconian methods are used at the middle management level as well as at the shop floor level.
Now, Jeff Bezos and his supporters often cite what they call data-driven management in terms of how the work environment is designed. And this essentially means that managers collect lots of data on worker productivity to determine whether they're good employees or not. In this day and age, you can essentially keep track of every minute that a worker might be working on their computer. What do you make of this approach?
Well, I think the first thing which has to be understood is that Amazon is an industrial company. Its regime is a direct descendant of the regimes which existed at the Ford plant in 1913 and which has characterized mass production ever since, insofar that it's engaged in repetitive processes. And the processes are involved in receiving goods, unpacking them, shelving them, repackaging them, sending them out. And the whole regime of metrics is designed to speed this up. Now, metrics regimes have a number of different elements to it. First of all, metrics are a simple way of recording what people are doing, whether financially or in purely quantitative terms, they record. The second element of metrics is to set up targets for what they ought to achieve. The third element of metrics is to increase those targets. So if it looks as though people are actually approaching their targets, you make them harder. So they're still scrambling. And the fourth element of metrics is a kind of regime of punishment which surrounds them, because with extremely draconian metric regimes like at Amazon, you are always trying to push employees to the point of their incompetence. You're pushing them to the point where the metrics are so demanding that they begin to fail to meet them. And at that point, what you do in the whole tradition of scientific management is to go in there and examine these processes for doing things and to speed them up,
Right.
to apply scientific management and speed them up. So you're pushing your workforce even harder, whether at the level of the employee on the fulfillment floor or, as with the Times, the middle managers.
Simon, before I get to my next question, I'm wondering if you can just ask the folks in your office to keep it down. It's a little distracting to hear them while you're answering the questions. I'm speaking with Simon Head, Senior and Associate Fellow of the Rothermere American Institute at Oxford. He is the author of The New Ruthless Economy, Work and Power in the Digital Age. His latest book is called Mindless, Smarter Machines Are Making Dumber Humans. And we're talking about the extensive article in the New York Times about Amazon Amazon.com's workplace, a workplace that sounds like a very, very difficult place to actually work. So let's talk, Simon, about how the fact that there were several earlier exposés of how horribly Amazon's warehouse workers were treated. But this article in the New York Times is a comprehensive examination of its higher level workers. Are the cultures of both parts of Amazon workplaces related to one another?
Yeah, they're deeply related. They're the same culture, only it's very much more difficult to apply the whole metrics regime to management. And really, this is something that has only happened in the last 20 years or so. But I would say that some of the methods described in the New York Times really cross serious moral frontiers. And I would refer in particular to this software system called Anytime Feedback Tool. So what that is doing is to encourage managers at the same level to report anonymously on the performance of their colleagues, which goes into a performance evaluation. And in the Amazon system, the people at the bottom of the league in terms of their performance get fired. And so there's a motive, and the Times makes this point, for little sort of cliques of managers to gang up on one of their colleagues and to send them down to the bottom of the league so that they'll be fired, and the people making the anonymous reports won't. And I really don't see any difference between this and the methods of the Stasi, the security police in East Germany. I really don't. And I think that, I hope that there'll be a real moral debate about the ethics of this, because this really does, I think, cross some very significant ethical boundaries.
Now, the article's authors say, quote, thanks in part to its ability to extract the most from from employees, Amazon is stronger than ever. Its swelling campus is transforming a swath of the city, Seattle. A 10 million square foot bet that tens of thousands of new workers will be able to sell everything to everyone, everywhere. Is it that level of ambition, Simon, that is driving this relentless workplace ethic?
Yeah, I think there's something very important which must be understood about Amazon. I mean, Bezos and his senior colleagues used the language of creativity and excellence to describe what they're doing. But, one mustn't lose sight of the fact that what they're doing is incredibly trivial. And there are good examples of that from the New York Times piece. They're getting a doll to somebody in New York City 23 minutes faster than they otherwise would have. They're figuring out a way to restock toilet paper by pushing a button. This is the level of what they're operating at. And, there's a broad ethical question. Is it justified in pushing human beings who deserve dignity in virtue of being human beings? Is it justified in pushing them and undermining their dignity for such utterly trivial reasons? And I think that there is no justification. And the practical conclusion from all this is that you need labor unions. The function of labor unions since the capitalist brutalism of the 19th century is to stop this from happening, to put limits on the predatory nature of capitalism. And Amazon is an absolute perfect case of the need to do this. And I think you actually need unions, not simply for the shop floor workers at the fulfillment centers. You need them for the staff. The middle management needs some sort of union to prevent this gross exploitation.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that was such an important aspect of what was going through my mind as I was reading this. This is exactly, just to rephrase what you said, this is why we need unions. I mean, there are examples in this New York Times piece about people who, whose spouses had some unexpected debilitating illness that they needed to take some time off to take care of them, or even, women taking maternity leave, or women or men, struggling themselves with an illness like cancer, and then basically coming back to find out that they had been demoted, or coming back too early from their medical leave because they were worried about being demoted. And that's just terrible.
Well, let me broaden the historical context on this, because if you look at the rise of capitalist brutalism in the 19th century, and of course the greatest account we have of it is that of Karl Marx in Das Kapital. The civic society in Europe, in Germany, in England, and in the United States was quite quick to understand what was going on in the mills, the textile mills of England, for example, and to begin to put in place restrictions on what the early capitalists could do. And what I would say in the present situation is that these control technologies are revolutionary in the sense that they increase by a factor of thousands the ability of managers to control and exploit workers both at the lower and middle level. And what is alarming today is that the civic society, the broader, the political, the literary, academic class, if you like, is being very slow to understand the revolutionary implications of these systems for people in work. And the fact that Amazon is getting away with what it does is a prime example of this. So, you know, the New York Times has done a great service in its expose, and we need a great many more of them.
Now, how unique is Amazon as far as you can tell compared to other major tech firms? Certainly, just as people fixate on Walmart because it is so big and sort of sets the standard and can change work culture in the same way, being the largest online retailer, Amazon certainly has the ability to set a new standard, which it seems to be doing. Are other companies like Facebook or Google and other tech companies following suit or taking their cue from Amazon, or is Amazon pretty much standing alone in its brutality?
I would say that Amazon is the most extreme example of pushing these systems to the limit that I've come across. But the basic characteristics of these systems, their descent from industrial systems and their descent from the tradition of Henry Ford and Frederick Winslow Taylor, whose influence in American business history is profound. The basic characteristics of the Ford-Taylor system are extremely widely diffused, both in American manufacturing and in the American service sector, whether it's healthcare, higher education, so-called customer relationship management, call centers, so-called human resource management. But what is alarming about Amazon is that they've pushed the envelope on this much further. And what is alarming is that the others will start to follow suit and will push a much wider segment of the American economy into this real dystopia, and that's what it is.
Now, there have been many responses to the New York Times piece. One article in U.S. News said, quote, "There are lots of jobs that aren't flexible and require long hours. Journalists work on tight deadlines at night in hurricanes and in wars, all without stock options. People have choices about where they work." How do you respond? If you don't like it, just go elsewhere, essentially.
Well, that's easier said than done, and particularly at the lower levels, where unemployment measured to include the people who are underemployed is high. And of course, what Amazon does, and we see it in the UK, where Amazon has a strong presence, where I am now, they locate their fulfillment centers in areas of pretty high unemployment, so that the people who take jobs at Amazon haven't got an awful lot of choice. And there's an overwhelming imbalance of power in favor of the management side. What's very interesting is that the one place in Western Europe and indeed in the world where there are strong unions and where they've really been fighting Amazon is in Germany. I think Amazon made a big mistake when they put a lot of their Central European centers in Germany, because the main German service union called Verdi has been fighting them. And given the balance of power in the German workplace, they have a good chance of succeeding against Amazon. And I deeply hope that they do.
Finally, Simon, do you think that Jeff Bezos and the top management at Amazon might respond to the New York Times expose, given that it was very well received and has caused a lot of discussion and prompted a lot of discussion?
Well, I think we need to see what happens now. I think we need to see how much of a follow-up there is to this, how many other investigations there are. I'd like to see people in Congress take this up. I'd like to see them hold hearings. I'd like to see Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton take this up. I'd like to see it enter the political arena in a way that it hasn't. So let's see what happens now. And when that does happen, I think Bezos will take notice.
And it's also interesting, it'll be interesting to see whether or not the article has an impact on the number of new hires and the number of new people who are willing and interested in working at Amazon. The article started out talking about the new worker orientation, where there's literally lines of new hires who will, most of them, be weeded out by the end of the year, also pointing to the very high turnover rates. And I'm wondering if you think that people might be less interested after reading that article and working for a place like Amazon. I mean, you have to be kind of a masochist.
Well, I think that people will think twice about presenting themselves for the Amazon regime from now on.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Simon, for joining us today and shedding some light on this issue beyond what the New York Times did. Thanks so much.
Great pleasure to be with you.
My guest is Simon Head. He is a senior and associate fellow of the Rothmere American Institute at Oxford and the author of The New Ruthless Economy, Work and Power in the Digital Age. His latest book is called Mindless: Smarter Machines Are Making Dumber Humans. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer and technical director. Christian Beck is our production coordinator, and Teddy Robinson and Kiana Turner are our audio engineers. Special thanks to Jonathan Alexander for technical assistance. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Golhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.